Good evening, everyone. I'm Erin Dumeyer. I'm director of the Mark Twain Library. And on behalf of the library and the Reading League of Women Voters, welcome to the third installment of the series, Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy. We are honored to have Dr. Daniel Barrett as moderator for this program. A professor and chair in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University and the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, Dr. Barrett is author of the textbook, Social Psychology, Core Concepts and Emerging Trends. His research interests include suspicion, persuasion, social influence, and cross-cultural psychology. He lives here in Reading, and it is a privilege to have him with us. This program follows a number of collaborative conversations organized by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library, whose partnership in this endeavor began in the fall of 2019. The series is brought to you in association with Easton Public Library, Ridgefield Library, Weston Public Library, Newtown's C.H. Booth Library, the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield, the League of Women Voters of Weston, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. We are recording tonight's program, so feel free to let your friends and neighbors know if they were not able to join us tonight, since a recording of this program will be available to view on the library's YouTube channel. There will be time for questions toward the end, but you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We are also offering closed captioning, and buttons for both of these features are on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so, friends and neighbors, it is a privilege this evening to welcome Dr. Daniel Barrett to Conversations.
Thank you, Erin, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth, myth, and democracy. I want to thank the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I'm a proud member, for organizing tonight's event. I also want to thank the other libraries and the league chapters who helped publicize it. And of course, a warm welcome to our audience and to our guests, Dr. Yuval Levin and Dr. William Galston. We are truly honored to have both of you here with us tonight. So let me introduce our two speakers in case you missed the opening video. Dr. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He is the founding and current editor of National Affairs, as well as a senior editor of the New Atlantis and a contributing editor to National Review. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy staff under President George W. Bush. He was also executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. In addition to being interviewed frequently on radio and television, Dr. Levin has also published essays and articles on numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Commentary. He is the author of several books on political theory and public policy, including most recently, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. He holds an MA and PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Yuval. Next, we have Dr. William Galston, who holds the Ezra K. Zilka Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies Program, where he serves as a senior fellow. Prior to January 2006, he was a Sol Stern professor and acting dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, the director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, founding director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, and executive director of the National Commission on Civic Renewal, co-chaired by former Secretary of Education William Bennett and former Senator Sam Nunn. He participated in 6 presidential campaigns. He served from 1993 to 1995 as a deputy assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy. Dr. Galston is the author of 9 books and more than 100 articles in the fields of political theory, public policy, and American politics. His most recent book is Anti-Pluralism, the Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. A winner of the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Award, Dr. Galston was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004, and he's appeared on all all principal television networks and is frequently a guest commentator on NPR. And he writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Bill. So the plan for tonight is I'm going to get the conversation going with some questions and prompts that I'll address to our guests. I have a lot of questions. We probably won't get to all of them tonight, but we'll see how far we can go. And around 8:30 or so, we'll turn to audience questions and I'll ask those, and then we'll proceed until about 9 p.m. That sound good? The topics and questions we'll address loosely fall under the title of our series, Truth, Myth, and Democracy. And we'll range from the current state of our democracy, possible threats to its stability. We'll discuss populism, inequality, crises in our institutions, polarization, race, and civic education. These topics crisscross somewhat, so probably see some themes coming up again and again throughout our conversation tonight. So the first topic I want to ask about is democracy. I want to ask about the current state of our liberal democracy. Many conservatives and liberals have expressed concern that a democracy is under threat from populism, nationalism, and just plain old attempts to undermine it by power-hungry politicians. We'll come back to some of these particular issues shortly, but let's start with a broader question. What is your diagnosis of the overall health of our democracy? And what is your prognosis regarding its future, say over the next 5 to 15 years? And let's start with Yuval, please.
Well, sure. Thank you very much, first of all, for drawing us together. I appreciate the opportunity for the conversation, especially the chance to talk with Bill Galston, who has done more than just about anybody I can think of to keep our democracy healthy and sane. I would say that it's important to talk about the state of our democracy in terms, as you put it, of liberal democracy. That is, in some ways, it's our liberal institutions, the protection of minority rights, the adherence to certain kinds of procedural standards, the institutions we have that keep our society, that allow our society to avoid eating itself alive, are, in my view, the ones most endangered. Democracy as such, democracy per se, certainly faces some threats and constraints. It faces a loss of confidence from the public that is, I think, distressing. But particularly threatened are those institutions of liberalism that provide us with the ability to be a democratic society, that is a place where the majority rules, but also to be a society that respects minorities, that respects and protects social peace, that tries to balance its various commitments in a way that allows people to lead their lives in the ways that they see as best. I think we've seen threats to American liberal democracy from a variety of sources in 21st century life, but in the past few years in particular, threats from, broadly speaking, a kind of populism, a rejection of the legitimacy of our political institutions that are rooted in the sense that the elites who run them are in it for themselves, a growing sense among the public, and you see it throughout our politics, though of course in some ways it's represented itself particularly on the right, that the people who run our core institutions can't be trusted, that their claims to authority should be rejected, and that ultimately our approach to our society should be in terms of us and them, rather than seeing American life as one whole of which we are all equal parts. Some of the complaints that characterize populism are justified. There are ways in which various kinds of inequalities and policy failures and abuses of power really have been ways in which elites in our society have taken steps that have harmed people in the lower tiers of education and income. But some of the complaints are also rooted in a kind of unrealism, in conspiracism, in a sense, an exaggerated sense of grievance. And it's up to leaders in a populist moment to help our society distinguish what's real from what's false, what can be addressed by politics from what cannot, and take real steps to address the underlying causes of populist discontent. And I think we've seen tremendous failures, and I say this plainly again on the right in particular, to distinguish the kind of constructive populism that can lead us to address inequalities from destructive populism that's rooted in unreality. And at this point, that certainly leaves me concerned about the state of our democratic institutions, the state of our liberal institutions. It's not all concern. I think it's easy to go overboard in diagnosing some of these troubles, but they are real troubles, and I'm sure we'll get deeper into them. But my basic sense is deep concern. I'm much more worried about the health of American institutions than I was, say, 5 years ago and 10 years ago.
Bill, you want to give it a shot?
Yep. Well, Yuval and I don't agree on everything politically, but I don't dissent from very much, if anything, of what he just said. I would add a couple of points. First of all, our society is more divided than at any time in my lifetime, which now spans 3/4 of a century. And this in itself is a source of deep concern to me, but not only to me, because it is becoming harder and harder to have the kinds of discussions that are the lifeblood of democracy. Democracy, when it's working well, proceeds through discussion. Now, obviously, it's a discussion framed by rules, and if confidence in the rules is breaking down, that's an additional problem. But first of all, you have to be able to talk to each other. And that is becoming more and more difficult. The share of discourse, whether in our formal political institutions or informally in society, that I would regard as constructive, has been declining steadily. So that's point number one. Our divisions, which are deep and wide, have consequences for democracy that are anything but benign. Secondly, while Yuval stressed the dangers to the liberal dimension of liberal democracy, I would stress new dangers to the democratic dimension of liberal democracy. Not until very recently has the basic credibility, trustworthiness, and fairness of the American electoral system been questioned to the extent that it's being questioned right now. I view it as tremendously troubling that a very large share of Americans and a majority of one of our two major political parties does not accept the results of the most recent presidential election as legitimate. And there are deliberate efforts to maintain that sense of illegitimacy and even to intensify it and to fan the flames of discontent with the President of the United States and others who hold elective office. I do not see how we can have a healthy democracy if a substantial number of people will accept the results of elections only if elections turn out the way they want them to. We cannot continue on this way. So yes, I share Yuval's deep concern about the liberal dimension of liberal democracy, but also about the democratic dimension.
Thank you. So let's take one of the threats that you both alluded to and discuss it in more detail. And one of the phenomena we've seen in the US over the last, say, 6 years or so is this phenomenal rise in populism. So you both discussed populism in your recent work and have raised concerns about the dangers it represents to our government and to our other institutions. Can you share with us just how would you define populism? Why do you think it has increased so much in the past, say 6 or so years? And the extent to which you think it to be it's pernicious versus innocent or innocuous in our society. So Bill, can we start with you, please?
That's a tough one, having written a book on the subject. But I think we can, it's always hard for authors to stop talking about their books. It's easy to get them to start talking about them. I will use a rough and ready definition of populism that is akin to the one that Yuval suggested. Populism rests on the distinction between the mass of the people, the real people, on the one hand, as opposed to elites who are somehow apart from the people. The people are seen as virtuous. The elites are seen as self-interested and out for themselves. The people are regarded as wise in that their common sense provides a reliable guide to not only their personal lives, but public policy. The elites are seen as pretending to a kind of wisdom and expertise that they do not possess. And you've seen that particular strand of populism during the pandemic, where the expertise of the medical profession, the public health profession, and many others has been called into question, and an epidemic of remedies and policies for which there is no medical or scientific expertise have been presented to the American people. And if there's no such thing as a valid claim to expertise, then just about anything goes. And we've seen that kind of anarchy break loose over the past couple of years within the context of the pandemic, but also before that. Now, having presented a not too flattering account of populism, let me proceed to do what Yuval did in his opening answer, and that is to talk about the justification of populism. And it does exist. Let me put it this way. In a democratic society, any claim to power, to privilege, to hierarchy, to authority over others stands in need of justification. It is not self-justifying that I should have the power to determine certain policies and you have the obligation to obey. Expertise, hierarchy has to be vindicated by its consequences. And it is difficult to say with a straight face that elites have made wise use of their power over the past 20 years. And I could go through a litany, in fact, of very familiar elite errors that everybody in this meeting, on the panel and in the audience, would recognize as failures, both domestic and foreign. The collapse of the US economy in 2008 and 2009, and the near outbreak of a global recession represented a tremendous failure of elite management of the economy. We entered into a major war on pretenses that turned out to be false. I'm not saying that the people who did that were knowingly lying to the American people, but they got something very big wrong, and we paid a huge price for it. I could go on and on with instances of elites using their power in a way that did not conduce to the well-being or the advancement of the American people's interests. And so people have a right to be suspicious of elites at this point because they, or should I say we, have not adequately justified ourselves to them. And we're going to have this problem for a long time unless and until we get back to a period such as the period in the decades immediately after the Second World War, when people who were managing the economy and managing foreign policy appeared to know what they were doing, and the people were by and large satisfied with the consequences of their use of their power.
Yuval?
Well, it's hard to find anything to add to that. I agree with it. I think it's very important to see that in eras of populism like this one, we also find that mutual trust declines precipitously in a free society. We find that there is a rise in what we now, I think, might term alienation, a sense that the country is there for other people, not for me, a difficulty in identifying with the larger society. These things are all connected. We're living in a time when there really are some striking differences between a discernible, definable American elite and the larger society, differences of education, differences of lifestyle, economic inequalities, differences that are very meaningful and that are increasingly defining our political differences in our society. And populism is a kind of response to the presence of those differences and to a sense that people with power are using that power for themselves and not for the rest of us. And, you know, as Bill says, we're living in a time when that kind of accusation seems to stick, because there are failures of what we expect of elites, which is competence, which is a kind of justification for authority. Also, restraint is enormously important in the way in which an elite might justify itself. And we seem to see now around us failures of all of those things. And those who, and the various elites in our society, and as Bill says, it's important to say us and not them in talking about people with power in various institutions, have in this sense earned a kind of populism. And there's populism on the left and on the right. They've been very powerful forces in the evolution of both of our political parties in recent years. And so the way in which our politics has grown so intensely divided in the way that Bill pointed to earlier is deeply connected to the populist character of this age. And both are connected to this fundamental underlying loss of trust. It is not easy to rebuild that kind of lost trust. And, you know, when we look to eras when it has been rebuilt, the challenge is that they are often eras of deep, profound crisis that the country comes through together and therefore comes out of with a sense of confidence and a sense of solidarity. And none of us would wish for a crisis like that, though we might think maybe we're living through such a crisis already, so that at least the silver lining of it might be that if it's handled well, we might come out of it with greater self-confidence and mutual trust. But we've arrived at this populist era the hard way. We've arrived at it by a loss of trust that in some respects has been earned, that in some respects has been a function of a kind of cultural fragmentation. It makes it difficult for people to feel like equal parts of a larger social whole. And in this moment in American life, the challenge that we confront in every corner of our society is a rebuilding of that trust, a drawing of people back into the institutions of our society and into a sense of solidarity. And the only other thing I would add is that the kind of division that we find characterizing our politics, the division that is so dangerous, as Bill suggested, is not just, and maybe not above all, a function of our country consisting of two parties that are at each other's throats at every turn. They also have to do with the sense that actually our two parties are not engaging with each other enough. I wouldn't simply say that we're fighting too much. In some ways, we're not fighting enough. We're not actually arguing. We're not actually confronting each other in arenas of contention in various institutions that could allow our disputes and differences to be turned to constructive ends. Instead, each of our parties is withdrawn into its own kind of echo chamber where people just hear their own views about the other party repeated to themselves at increasing levels of intensity. And each party now becomes persuaded that the other party is the country's biggest problem and that there's no way out except by some kind of ultimate victory against the other party. Democracy does not provide you with ultimate victories against the other party. And in thinking about how to work to help our society out of this trouble, we need to think about how to empower those institutions that can function as arenas of contention. Congress is one, the key one in our national politics. The academy has a role in this, the media has a role in this, the larger culture does, that could allow people to hear each other, to engage with people they disagree with as fellow citizens, and not just as abstractions that they can hate without consequences. And to see that ultimately the way forward is by compromising, by bargaining, by working together around differences, rather than just by working ourselves up to the view that if the other party gets its way, then we are falling over the abyss and it's all over. I think we've got to find ways to back off of that attitude about politics and find our way back to a genuine democratic politics, a politics of engagement and bargaining and compromise. There's a role for our politicians in that. There's a role for us as citizens in that. There's a role for civil society in that. But I think we have to see that as the goal if we're going to find our way from a politics of populism that, as we've said, is partially justified and partially not, to a politics of solving problems that might actually lower the temperature in a constructive way.
When Yuval talks, I start thinking, which is why I always enjoy appearing with him. I would just add two thoughts. Number one, historically, it has been the case that we have come together in moments of crisis, which is precisely what makes the current moment so troubling. I would call a pandemic that has killed nearly 700,000 of our fellow citizens a domestic crisis, right? We have had very large wars that killed fewer Americans. And yet, this crisis, rather than bringing us together, has pulled us apart. We need to think very hard about that. I just finished the draft of an article this afternoon that looked at the response to the pandemic along partisan lines. And the gap between, say, the vaccination rates of Democrats and the vaccination rate of Republicans is now close to 30 percentage points. This is astonishing, right? And it has divided us, not only medically, but also culturally. Here's the second point I want to make. The country is pulling apart because there are parts of the country that are having fundamentally different experiences. In the 4 decades after the Second World War, the country grew together not only along class lines, but also along geographical lines. The enormous differences among the states and regions narrowed very substantially during that period. In recent decades, the relationship among regions has gone in exactly the opposite direction, and urban areas have moved ahead. Small towns and rural areas have fallen back. The economies of small towns and rural areas, mining and traditional manufacturing in particular, have fallen on hard times. The information economies of the major urban areas have turned into great engines of wealth. And people without college degrees who find themselves in a shrinking and declining older economy are bewildered. All of that economy was working well for them, and it was working well for their parents, but it's not working well for them anymore, and it's certainly not working well for their children. And so coming together is not just a cultural issue, although it is very much a cultural issue. It's also an economic issue. We have to figure out ways of reintegrating economically and providing opportunity across the entire country and not just in pockets of it. Otherwise, these resentments are bound to fester.
So you both touched on a number of topics I want to come back to a little bit later on. But let me just stay on populism for just a moment. So history has shown that populism and nationalism very often ebb and flow together. Populism typically has a nativism or nativistic component to it that ties it to specific, if dangerous, nationalistic tendencies, sort of anti-immigration, anti-immigrant, America first, claims that my party, my leader represents the singular will of all the people, at least all the right people in my culture, things like that. How do you see the relationship between populism and nationalism? And Would you follow someone like George Orwell, who talks about nationalism versus patriotism and how the one is a very negative, aggressive, hostile thing that can pull nations apart, but patriotism is sort of the opposite of that, a much more positive, unifying theme or trend or tendency? So again, so how would you see that relationship between populism, nationalism, and is there a patriotism we can kind of appeal to in some way to overcome these other tendencies that we're talking about? And either one of you could take that first question.
Well, I'll give it a shot. Look, I think that nationalism is a term that means too many things to quite be useful in a conversation like this. I would say nationalism can mean just patriotism. That's what some people mean when they say it. They want to be a little more provocative about their patriotism, and they call it nationalism. Nationalism can also mean, as you describe it, an attitude that defines friends and enemies, that tries to distinguish who is us and who is our enemy, in a way that can be, of course, very destructive to the life of a free society. Nationalism can also be a way of organizing your thinking around foreign affairs, nationalism as opposed to globalism, for example, a way of thinking that puts the nation state at the center of your thinking. Nationalism also can be a way of organizing your thinking on domestic issues, nationalism as opposed to localism, progressive nationalism from the beginning of the 20th century, which saw itself as a kind of centralizing movement. I think that I'd put it this way, and I don't know. Well, let me just say, I think that a few years ago, at the beginning of the Trump era, it seemed as though nationalism might turn out to be a kind of organizing principle of what's different about the right in this moment from what it had been before. I think that has not turned out to be quite right. And that the tie between nationalism and populism is also not as clarifying as we might have imagined. There's a populism of the left that is not particularly nationalistic in any way that I mean, it doesn't describe itself that way, and I don't think it ought to be described that way. There's a populism of the right that has various traditional elements of nationalism, but that I think is not fundamentally defined by them. We've certainly seen a change in the attitudes of the two parties toward immigration in the last 20 years, where the Democrats have become much more friendly to immigration than they used to be. Republicans have become much more hostile to immigration than they used to be. I'm not sure that the category of nationalism is quite the way to think about that. I do think that both left and right, and that everybody in American society now is searching for forms of solidarity. We live in a time that is screaming for solidarity, where people feel lonely, isolated, alienated, so that while in the middle of the 20th century, that very unified moment that Bill mentioned, American culture was screaming for liberation from conformity. I think our culture is now screaming for solidarity. I think things like identity politics on the left are one answer to that, an attempt to find some description of solidarity. I think the kind of nationalism you find on the right is another answer to that. I think these are both pretty clumsy and exclusionary and ultimately illiberal answers to that, but that we're also seeking better answers to that our society is looking for solidarity alongside its commitment to liberty, and that this can be a very constructive thing, though it also can have dark facets. And I've come to think that nationalism isn't quite the way to organize our thinking around that question, though surely it has some role in helping explain this moment.
That was a terrific answer. And let me just add a couple of points. It is perfectly respectable to love one's country above all other countries. And I think that the left side of the political spectrum has made a mistake by de-emphasizing or even delegitimizing the idea of loving one's own, having a preference for one's own, that in some cases takes priority over a more universalistic understanding. And it's very difficult to conduct politics or indeed human affairs without acknowledging the legitimacy of loving one's own and preferring one's own. Let me give you a very concrete example that may raise some hackles. It wasn't a right-wing government that decided to inoculate Americans before massively sharing our vaccines with the rest of the world. It was a clear example of collective self-preference. I have heard some internationally minded bureaucrats arguing that it doesn't matter who invents or produces things like vaccines. They ought to be distributed globally without regard to national boundaries. Whatever you call it, patriotism, nationalism, love of one's own, a politics that tries to proceed as though those sentiments do not exist or as though they are not legitimate up to a point is bound to get into trouble and will open the door for what I might call excessive self-preference, where America first turns into America only, turns into, I don't really care about the rest of you, I only care about me and mine. There's a famous statement of Rabbi Hillel's, that has been repeated thousands of times, and probably many of you have heard it, but it still contains an essential truth. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm not willing to fight for myself, then we cannot count on others to fill in for our lack of self-assertion. But if I'm only for myself, who am I? That's the essential tension. And I think a lot of populist conservatives get it wrong at one extreme. And a lot of people on my side of the fence go to the other extreme and also get it wrong for that reason.
We want to a related question that stems from preferences in a fundamental way and deciding who belongs and who doesn't belong. And that's about race and racism. And neither of you, at least in the works that I've read, devote much attention to race and racism. It's indisputable that race and racism have hugely impacted our history and our culture, and that they continue to do so today. It seems that we can pretty easily draw a line from at least some forms of populism through to nativism, to pronouncing specific groups as being true or real citizens, then on to racialized preferences, racism, anti-immigrant sentiments, behaviors, policies, and so on down the line. We certainly see the tremendous effects of racism on education, housing, medical care, the justice system, and such. It's hard to overstate the effects it's had. So consequently, after reading both of your works, I was left wondering why race and racism don't figure more prominently in your work. Bill, I know you talk about pluralism in several of your books, and that certainly encompasses lots of differences, including racial differences. But even there, you don't spend much time on race itself. And so I wanted to ask each of you if you could talk about what you see as the influence of race on contemporary politics, discourse, and on economic, social, and political divisions and inequalities in our country today, and what we might do to sort of overcome some of those. Bill, you want to start?
Right, a fertile field. And I would put my views very, very simply. There is only one thing that can possibly unify the United States along racial lines, ethnic lines, and religious lines, and the other lines of division. And that is what I will, in a very old-fashioned way, call our founding creed. An idea of citizenship and civic membership that does not appeal to a particular race or ethnicity or religion as the core of our national identity. and of civic membership and citizenship. That is the only way forward. And the two major forces pulling in the other direction throughout American history have been racism and nativism. Both represent challenges in principle to the only basis of national unity, solidarity, and commonality. If there is a better way of unifying the country, nobody has yet come up with it, and I confidently predict that no one will. And I don't have to go into great detail about ways in which our treatment of African Americans, of immigrants, of Native Americans and others has fallen very, very far short of that mark. And I will confess that I never thought that I had any particular competence or standing to address those questions. But if I say more, I think I know what I'm going to say. But if the question becomes a practical one of how to overcome the consequences of this shortfall along racial and ethnic lines, along the lines of immigration versus quote unquote native-born Americans. I smile when I say that. FDR once gave a speech to the Daughters of the American Revolution, which he began with two words: fellow immigrants. And by doing that, he intended to convey a very deep truth about America. And that is, with the exception of people who were here long before we were here, we have come either on the decks of boats freely or in the underbellies of boats unfreely. But as many people have said, we're all in the same boat now. What is that boat? That boat is constructed sturdily out of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States and their ever widening application to more and more people within the society until they achieve real universality. What to do on the economic front is a very long story. I've written a lot of papers at the Brookings Institution on that question, but I wouldn't expect you to have delved into all of those.
Well, the only thing I would add to that, I mean, I think that's just the right way to think about that question. And I would say to you that for me, part of what it means to be a conservative is to think of society as a single whole across time, to see that we are the society that is guilty of its own past crimes, but that also owns the idealism, the ambitions of prior generations, and that owes those to the future. So that when we talk about slavery, when we talk about Jim Crow, we should say we and us, and we should see that those things reflect on us and continue in our own time, and that their implications persist, and that there are forms of them that we need to keep fighting. We can't just say that was in the past, it doesn't apply to us. That was us and it is us. But what it means to say that it was us and it is us is also to say that we are a society that has been fighting against these evils from its beginnings too. The society that began by proclaiming a commitment to the equality of all human beings, even when it plainly wasn't living up to that, and even when it still isn't living up to that, is still nonetheless a society that holds itself to that standard and that can look to that standard in making judgments about the present and the future. And I think it's very important that in helping to in helping our children to claim their inheritance as Americans, we help them see both our failures in the past to live up to those ideals and the value of those ideals as inheritances for them. I am an immigrant. I came to the United States when I was a child, and have adopted this society as my own. And one of the things that I love most about it is its own constantly, endlessly self-searching commitment to improve itself along exactly these lines. There's no question that racism persists as a reality in American life and as a stain on any claim that we might make to the greatness of our society. But I think there's also no question about the greatness of our society, and that among the reasons for thinking that it is great is that it is committed to an ideal that would treat racism as a failure to be fully who we are, that would look to racism as a failure to live up to the American creed, as Bill says. And in that sense, we're very blessed to have that creed, and we should do all we can to live up to it. So I don't think we can deny or should try to deny that past, but I think that we should see that what it means to live up to that past, it allows us ways now of fighting racism too. We can't simply treat our past as though it were one long failure on this front. It is not. It also offers us many examples of how to fight for justice and for equality, and for the sorts of ideals that we claim for ourselves. And that's why it's important to make sure that the rising generation is taught what it is to be an American, for good and bad. And there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad. There's no way around that.
Let me just add to this discussion, which has been a little bit general up to now, an example that troubles me as a scholar or as a citizen. In America, part of the American dream and an essential element of wealth building has been home ownership. And there was a huge surge in the United States right after the Second World War from mainly a rental society, especially in the cities, to a home ownership society in the suburbs. Government programs greatly, particularly the Federal Housing Administration, greatly facilitated that process of expanding home ownership, but African Americans and others were almost entirely excluded from programs like that. As a result, they did not participate in one of the great leaps forward, if I can use that phrase, in wealth building in the United States. And the consequences of that exclusion linger to the present day. Huge differences, 20 percentage points in home ownership rates, and therefore in wealth building opportunities. What do we as a country owe to the people who were excluded from the fruits of those programs? What do we owe to their children and grandchildren? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do know it's a question that I'm having an increasingly hard time avoiding.
Yuval, do you want to try to answer that question for Bill?
Well,
Very easy.
I mean,
one.
Look, I think it's important to think in those terms and to see how some of the ways in which we've tried to address social problems in our past have also been ways of exacerbating some problems because they've been addressed in unequal ways. The commitment to home ownership has been something of a problem since the early years of this century, where I worked for an administration that for 7 years was very, very proud of the ways in which it was helping people become homeowners, including especially minority homeowners. And then it turned out that some of those policies went too far and created a tremendous economic crisis that had a lot to do, frankly, with housing policy that was aimed at advancing homeownership. And that is only to say that there's no simple way forward here, that we always have to think about the consequences of public policies, the unintended effects as well as the intended. But I certainly agree when it comes to homeownership, when it comes to access to higher education. The GI Bill too was deployed in very unequal ways in the wake of the Second World War and allowed many Americans to gain access to higher education, but not many Black Americans to gain access to higher education. And there too, I think we have to think in terms of how to address the consequences of that, even as we think more broadly about how to change our society's attitude toward higher education and what that should have to do with economic opportunities. That's not an answer. That's a restatement of the problem. If I had an answer, you can be sure that I would offer it here and elsewhere.
Well, in the interest of solidarity, Yuval, the administration that I worked for was committed to that proudly for the full 8 years. And we're very lucky that we didn't have that awkward little interruption that you experienced in the 8th year.
So we've kind of veered off now into talking about inequality, at least to some extent. And let me ask you a question about that in particular. So in recent years, we've seen inequality in this country probably rival or exceed what we saw in the Gilded Age, back over 100 years ago. So my question is, do you think that economic inequality is a fundamental problem in the United States right now? Is it tied to populism, loss of community, belongingness, and so forth, and also to polarization? And if you do think that, do you think the US government, the federal government, should be involved in trying to help us overcome inequality by being an activist in some way? Or if you don't think that's the solution, what might you recommend we do as a culture, as a nation, to try to overcome these great inequalities between the rich and the poor? Bill, you want to start us off?
Well, I think we may have found an area where, Yuval and I, but I'm not sure, might be a little farther apart than in some of the other areas.
I was trying to find one because you guys were agreeing just far too much for me.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Thank you for saying that.
We've been agreeing vehemently. Look, Yuval and I have something important in common as academics, namely that we were both trained in political philosophy, not just contemporary political philosophy, but the history of political philosophy. And, the Greek political theorist Aristotle had a huge influence on me. I remember reading his book, The Politics, as an undergraduate, and learning from him that the stability of constitutional systems was best served by a distribution of property and wealth that had a very strong middle class in the middle. A society divided between a large number of poor people and a very small number of very rich people was a society that was bound to be in turmoil and conflict and would have a very hard time maintaining a stable constitutional or republican order. I'll call that Aristotle's law. It has not been repealed. And so the topic that you began with, and democracy, and the topic that you've now directed our attention to, namely inequality, are very powerfully linked. So in any society in which the middle class feels beleaguered, when it is not strong, confident, growing, prosperous, and where the middle class begins to look upwards with envy and even hatred at people who are more successful, wealthier, more prosperous, is a society that's bound to be divided. And my reading of the economic statistics is that, yes, we have become more economically unequal as a society than we were, say, in the early 1970s. So it's been 50 years of growing inequality, sometimes slowly, sometimes very rapidly. And we have developed now a new class of super rich whose wealth just dwarfs everyone else's. Do I think that everybody should be cut down to the same size, that there should be some sort of political scythe that levels everybody? No, I don't. But if you ask me who should bear the lion's share of the burden of making up for the consequences of this growing inequality, for education, for public services, I I believe that it is perfectly reasonable to ask people who have gained so much to make a very substantial contribution. And what form should that contribution take? I am not in principle opposed to a wealth tax. In practice, it seems not to work very well, which is why most European countries that enacted one have since repealed it. But should the wealthy in our society pay a higher share of their income in taxes? Should there be a more rigorous taxation system for states? I could go on with questions in this vein, but my answer to each and every one of them is going to be yes, I think they should. Obviously, I'll make the conservative point. You don't want to kill the goose that kills the golden egg, that lays the golden eggs. But it is not clear to me that if someone with $6 billion at the end of a decade only has $5 billion, that the goose has been killed, tamed maybe, but not killed.
Well, I would say first and foremost that I tend to think that inequality is not the right framework through which to think about the kinds of questions that Bill just raised. The conversations we have around inequality tend very quickly to focus on the super rich. And there are people in America who are very, very wealthy. And they should pay high taxes, and they pay fairly high taxes. They could pay higher taxes. The fact is, a lot of our tax debates are about very small differences. We have intense arguments about whether the top rate should be 37 or 39%, and that's just not a big difference. I think that we have to see that the challenge that confronts people who start out with disadvantages in American life are challenges about reaching the middle and making their way through the middle. And those are not fundamentally caused by the existence of the super wealthy. Wealth is not a social problem. Poverty is a social problem. And poverty deserves our attention, not just poverty, but immobility more than inequality, I think is how we ought to approach the kinds of socioeconomic problems that our society faces, so that people have a sense that they can improve their condition, that their children, regardless of where they start, have a chance to rise. And I think our society is not good enough now at providing people with those kinds of opportunities. There are bottlenecks. A college degree is much too important in making it up in our society. And we have to think about other ways of allowing people to have paths upward. We have to think about ways of lifting burdens off those who start with disadvantages, who start maybe in a broken family or a broken community, or in a community that has been historically disadvantaged in ways that make it difficult for them to know how to make it up in our society. We have to look for ways to do that. I don't think that a lot of that is going to involve thinking about the super rich. Now, it's worth thinking about them if our government needs more revenue, which it does. And so it's worth thinking about them. I don't think that higher taxes on the wealthy should be off the table, but I tend not to think that they're going to have that much to do with these more profound problems of immobility and disadvantage that have to be thought about in their own terms, and that I don't think we get very far if we understand those through the lens of inequality in any fundamental way.
Well, I have lots of things that I could say in reply, but we've now reached 8:30, so perhaps I should suppress that.
I'm going to ask one more of my questions, and we'll turn to the audience questions. So this is going away from inequality and talking about our institutions. And both of you have talked about this in your recent work, about how many of our institutions have failed us or have been undermined, weakened in recent decades, I suppose. And certainly Yuval, you've written about this extensively in your last two books. And you talk about institutions as these durable forms of our common life, or frameworks and structures of what we do together. And you argue that we've lost faith or trust in a wide range of institutions that formerly help fulfill essential human needs. So could you just talk a little bit about what institutions you're referring to? I know it's a whole bunch of them, but just at least give the audience some flavor for what you're talking about here. Why has the crisis come about, and what can we do to start overcoming this crisis?
Well, that's no small question. You've put me in the position that you put Bill in before, which is I wrote a book about this, so I'm going to have trouble being concise. And I'm going to try my best not just to read the book aloud to you from start to finish. But I would say that the kinds of problems we face now as a country are such that require us to think seriously about institutions, to see institutions, which we tend to look through in American life or to treat as invisible. Our institutions, as you say, I think of them as the forms of our common life, the ways in which we act together. And an institution allows a group of people to pursue a common goal by giving them each roles in relation to others and in relation to that common goal. Some institutions are organizations, right? You could think about a school or a hospital or a civic organization or civic institution. Some institutions aren't formally corporate organizations like that. The family is an institution. It's the first and foremost institution of any society. You could think about a profession as an institution. The rule of law as an institution. That they're durable is one reason why they matter. They keep their shape over time, and so they shape a certain portion of our national life. But it's especially important that they are forms in the deepest sense. They give shape to how we live. And because of that, they're also formative of us. They shape people. The institutions that we're part of, your church, your school, the kind of workplace where you work, the kind of profession you might have, they shape you. They turn you into a particular human type. And the reason why we tend to trust institutions when we do is that we trust that human type. We think they're good at creating a trustworthy person. So I trust my accountant, not because she understands the carried interest rule, though I hope she does, because I don't, but I trust her because I think that there are certain things that she would and would not do because she's an accountant. And that means she wouldn't put her name to a lie. She wouldn't make things up. She'll follow the rules. And that's what I need from her. That's why I might trust a lawyer. I might trust a journalist because that's a person who follows a set of rules so that before he says something to me, it's been checked and verified and I have some reason to trust it. I think we lose trust in our institutions when we lose the sense that they form people that can be relied on that way. And obviously that can happen sometimes through sheer incompetence when they don't seem to be able to do their work. Sometimes it happens through corruption and abuse of power. When a bank cheats its customers, when a member of the clergy abuses a child, that's an abuse of power that means we can't trust that institution. But there's also a way that, particularly in our time, our institutions have given us reasons to trust them less, which is that rather than function as molds of character, as ways of shaping the people within them, institutions have come to function as platforms for performance, as a place to stand and show yourself or build your own brand, build your own following, rather than be shaped by the institution to play a certain part in society. We see this in our politics, where, and if you look at Congress now, you find an awful lot of performance art of people who use Congress as a high place to stand and look into the camera and participate in the culture war from a particularly prominent vantage point, rather than be shaped into legislators and be brought by the institution together to work, to compromise, to bargain. You see this in a lot of our institutions that have become stages for performance, a place to stand and say, I'm in this party, not in that party. So that rather than the church be a place that shapes souls, it's a place that now is used to express political views. You might say the same of the university or of certain professions or corporations. I think that kind of transformation of institutions from molds into platforms is one important reason why we've been losing trust in institutions, particularly in this period in American life. And that a recovery of trust, therefore, requires a kind of recovery of institutionalism, a recovery of the capacity to ask ourselves, what role do I have because I play a part in this institution, rather than because I'm in that political party or because I want to be seen in this way or that way. And you know, as I say, I'm shortening an argument that was book length, but my sense is that this transformation of our expectation of institutions has a lot to do with the decline of trust across the range of institutions in our society. from politics to the academy to the professions to religion to civil society and beyond, in ways that not only might help us diagnose the problem, but might give each of us something to do about it in those institutions where we have some role to play, and we each have a role to play in some set of institutions. And so this is a way of thinking both about the nature of the problem and about what might be done to address it.
I wonder if I might add just a word. I mean, I think that Yuval has just laid out an eloquent and elegant and an accurate diagnosis of where we are now. Because I'm considerably older than Yuval, I lived through a period of what might be called a hyper institutionalization of American society. And starting in the late 1950s, there was a great revolt against those institutions, which were experienced by many of their denizens as not formative so much as oppressive. And there was an enormous literature in the 1950s that started with corporate life, the man in the gray flannel suit, segued to family life, the feminine mystique, and went on to a criticism of various institutions, which I think which were for reasons not all of which were simple adolescent rebellion, but which reflected major imperfections in those institutions and in, following Yuval, I will call their formative consequences. And so, and what we're looking for now is a point of equipoise in a very long historical cycle in American society that started with what I believe was excessive and oppressive institutionalization of individual life, and is turned into its excess, its mirror, its opposite. Where is that point of balance?
I would only say that I agree with that. And I think that point too was not the beginning, but was the product of a long process that occurred in response to another period of collapsing trust in institutions and in elites, a period that took up most of the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And so you might say there's a kind of pendulum that swings in American life from trust to mistrust. We react to an excess of conformist institutions by liberating ourselves into individualism. We react to an excess of individualism by looking for, again, forms of solidarity, but also legitimate authority. And I think we are in a moment now that is looking for forms of solidarity and legitimate authority. And that's not always what we need, but it's a lot of what we need in this moment. And it requires us to recover a vocabulary that doesn't really come naturally to us as Americans. And that forces us to see the limits of individualism, which is a challenge in different ways for people all across the range of our politics and culture.
Yep.
So you both mentioned solidarity. I have a question actually two questions from the same audience person, that one directed to each one of you. Let me just read them both to you and then have you respond in order. So the first one is for Dr. Levin. In your Wall Street Journal book review in October, 1 year ago, about Robert Putnam et al.'s sequel to Bowling Alone, you mentioned that they stated that, in this quotes, a recovery of solidarity is achievable, end quotes. Do you now agree with this, or you still agree with that? And if so, how? And then the question for Bill is similar. This is Bill, recalling with admiration your leadership with Henry Cisneros of our housing policy project at the American Assembly. I wonder what government policies you believe now would help move our society towards solidarity. So Yuval, if you want to go first, and then Bill second, please.
Sure. I thank you for the question. And I certainly do think that solidarity is recoverable. I'm hopeful. But I also think that it's an enormous challenge. I would distinguish hope from optimism on this front. Optimism is kind of passive and just says things are going to be okay. That's really not my view of American life in this moment. Hope calls for action. Hope says things could be better if we take the steps that are needed for that to happen. My hopefulness about the potential for recovery of solidarity in America really begins by looking at the country from the bottom up and not the top down. I think we can see reasons for hope when we see the ways in which people at the local level, in some cases at the state and regional level too, are able to respond to problems in practical ways. I live in the state of Maryland, which has a pretty conservative Republican governor, a very, on the whole, very progressive Democratic legislature, and they work together every day because they just have to. The institutions that compel them to cooperate still function. And I think you also see at the local level, in many ways, practical problems drive people to work together. They don't put aside all their differences, but they do find ways to address problems together. I think that if we invest more of our time, more of our energy in that way, in trying to address practical problems together as citizens, as neighbors, through civil society, but also through politics and government, we stand a better chance of recovering paths to solidarity. In the process, we will find that there is more that unites us than we imagine. But when we think about our politics in abstract terms from the top down, as this is one party and that's another party, and I don't want anything to do with them, it becomes very difficult to imagine both ways of solving practical problems and ways of recovering solidarity. So to me, a recovery of solidarity requires a recommitment to a kind of a somewhat decentralized way of thinking about how to solve problems in America. Not every problem is amenable to being taken up that way, but I think it's worth our looking for those that can be, and looking for ways of building institutions at the ground level, not just restoring those that are there, but really building institutions at the ground level. And that book that you mentioned by Robert Putnam and a co-author who I'm forgetting her name, and it's a terrible injustice to her, but which is a kind of sequel to Putnam's Bowling Alone, ultimately suggests that there are ways of bridging and building forms of solidarity by thinking about practical problem solving. And I think that's true. I think that remains true in America, and that it can be a way forward for us now.
Well, I'll get personal for just a minute. When I was in the Clinton administration, I had the privilege of being part of a little band that drew up the specifications for the National Service Program we now know as AmeriCorps. And the basic idea of AmeriCorps was that the program would help people at the local level get together to solve problems, and it would provide young people with the means that they would need in order to work with other people in local organizations, local communities on those problems. We didn't invent this idea. In the months before Bill Clinton was inaugurated, we went around the country touring local service programs and looking at the ones that seemed to be doing really well. The ones that were doing really well were ones that brought people together in common work over extended periods of time, not just for an hour or two every day, but actually working at it on a daily basis, day after day, week after week, for 6 months, a year, 2 years, what have you. And I do think that solidarity is created and reinforced through common work. And I will confess further that as someone who was drafted at the peak of Vietnam era, I have many reasons to dislike the draft, but they are not as powerful as the reasons that lead me, at least in principle, to favor it. Namely, as an experience that a large number of citizens go through together. Military service has been a source of solidarity historically and down to the present day. We obviously have a very different form of military service now. I'm not advocating a return to the draft, but I have seen, for example, proposals that would give young people a choice in the summer between 3 months of common civilian work and 3 months of basic military training. I don't think those are bad ideas. I think we should give it a try because solidarity is not something, a sense of community, of sharing, is not something that can be created through moral exhortation, can only be created through action. The philosopher William James talked about the moral equivalent of war. I have concluded that there is no moral equivalent of war, but we have to think a little harder about solidaristic experiences for civilians in times of peace.
So one more question. We have several questions asked about social media and more traditional media, cable TV, MSNBC, Fox News, etc., and their roles in exacerbating the political divisions in our country. We kind of know all that already. I'm not going to ask you to diagnose that problem. We know that's the problem. It's a huge problem. But the bigger problem, I guess, for us is how do we solve this? How do we actually get away from this fragmented country, this fragmented social media where almost anything goes? On the one hand, we see once in a while Facebook or Google will kind of flail at the problem, say, we're going to change this, this, and this about it. It's going to make this better. We know it doesn't last very long. On the other hand, we see Congress trying to do the same thing, trying to figure out, first of all, what are these social media about? Most of the folks in Congress seem to have no idea what Facebook really is. But if we push aside the technology issue there and kind of the generational gap there, they're also flailing to find solutions to some of these problems that, again, we're seeing exacerbated by media, social media, et cetera. So my question to you in the last few minutes here is, do you have any magical solutions for us? But seriously, how might we as a society attack some of these divisions and rein in some of this stuff without, at the same time, curtailing free speech, which we don't want to do?
Since this is an area of profound ignorance on my part, I'll sail right in, right? Ignorance is wonderfully freeing. And, and as the poet has instructed us, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But there's an saying from classical antiquity that guided the medical profession in its early days. It's called the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. It's one thing for a media platform to open its doors to all of the different forms of noxious opinions that exist these days. But as I understand it, platforms like Facebook are doing more than allowing for the expression of these opinions. They are using their algorithms. They're using their model deliberately to bring these opinions together into communities of the like-minded. And there's a lot of social science research that's been conducted in the past 10 years or so, suggesting that when you deliberately engineer communities of the like-minded, you are creating echo chambers within which whatever beliefs they share become more and more extreme and monolithic. So my first suggestion would be forms of public regulation that prevent internet platforms from deliberately engineering these kinds of echo chambers, which they do because it's good for business, but it's bad for the rest of us. And I think that most Americans, if this idea is explained in clear, simple terms, would agree that this form of regulation, it does not in any way restrict free speech, but it restricts corporations' efforts to organize speech into artificial communities of the like-minded that then become entrenched.
Well, I would only say, I think, first of all, it's very important to linger for a moment on that phrase, it's good for business, because it's crucial to see that a lot of the fragmentation, as you say, that we've seen, and of the collection of the creation of these kinds of echo chambers are a function of the fundamental business model of contemporary social media and media, really. The business model of journalism used to be that you had to sell classified ads, and so you needed as broad an audience as possible. And a broad audience is well served by news and information that is not partisan, so that it could appeal to as many people as possible. In the last 30 years and more, journalism has worked on a more directed, focused advertising model, where rather than deliver a broad audience, you want to deliver a narrow audience of exactly the people you mean to reach. And to deliver that means to be selective in the kinds of people you draw, which has made journalism in general more political, but especially works effectively online, where you can really deliver to an advertiser a very narrowly selected sliver of the population that is most likely to be interested in what they're selling. That is the essential business model of contemporary social media. You have to stop yourself when you're using Facebook or Twitter and ask, I'm not paying for this, so I'm not their customer. So what am I? Well, you're the product. You're the product they're offering to their customer, who is an advertiser. And I think it's very important to enter that world as a knowledgeable consumer and understand that that is what's going on here and that there are real costs to it. Now, I also do think that there are ways in which some forms of regulation may be appropriate. I don't know that we're at a place where we quite know what those are. It seems to me that a lot of the language we use to think about regulation of this space is language that is drawn from the regulation of the industrialization of the American economy in the 19th century, early 20th century. It's appropriate in some respects, but not in others. And that language, too, had to be created from scratch in response to a slowly emerging understanding on the part of policymakers and citizens of the sort of challenge that they faced. I think we're in that phase now where we're trying to get our arms around this question. I wouldn't say I have my arms around it, so I don't think that I do have a magical solution here, but I think that it is absolutely essential that we understand that this can be an area that requires some engagement from public policy, because there are new forms of social power here. There are new forms of economic power, political power that we haven't quite defined for ourselves. I will only say as a plug for my colleagues that we at the American Enterprise Institute have been working on defining some of this vocabulary over the past couple of years. And among other things, there'll be a book published in the middle of October, so just a couple of weeks from now, that tries to look at social media in terms of economic power, political power, information power, and geostrategic power, and just tries to help policymakers think about what is this? What is Facebook as an object for you as a policymaker? I worry that we're only at that level. I mean, I watched a part of a hearing just today of a Senate committee talking to some executives from several of the social media companies, and you're just left thinking, wow, these people know even less than I do about what they're dealing with here. And getting policymakers informed, informing ourselves as citizens is really essential before we jump in headfirst to regulation. But I think that that process of getting informed probably will lead to some regulation, and probably should. I mean, there really are. This is transforming American life in ways that that our political system is going to need to speak to over time.
So let me try to squeeze in one more question here, which is one that would beg long answers, but I'm asking you not to give long answers if you can. So you might have to simplify it a little bit. So one of our audience members asked about political parties and whether if we had more parties that were, actually important, influential parties, would that make a difference in our democracy and in our civil discourse? So let me just rephrase that slightly by asking you just quickly, is our two-party system part of the problem or part of the solution, or maybe both? If it can be part of the solution, what could it do to actually help us overcome these divisions? Or would we be better off in some hypothetical world if we had a third or fourth or fifth party that actually had some national presence and some national power? Yuval, you want to start us off?
Sure. There's a lot to be said here. It's a subject that I've tried to work on over the years quite a bit. So I will only say, I think the problem we have is not exactly that we have two parties, but that we've gotten to a place where we kind of have zero parties. The parties as institutions are maybe the best example of what a transformation from mold into platform really looks like. The parties now are just platforms. They don't really select candidates. They don't really define agendas. They don't really build a constituency. They're a banner. They're a way to, they're a stage on which narcissists can stand. I think parties that are more like parties, that play an actual role as repositories of political professionalism and as ways of choosing candidates, could be very useful in our contemporary politics. And in that sense, I don't think the problem is the two-party system, a system which is very deeply ingrained in our politics at this point and wouldn't easily be changed. I'm not of the view that changing that needs to be the priority. But I think that empowering the parties to have some greater role in candidate selection, I tend to think that the primaries were a terrible mistake, and that we need to look for ways to allow some political professionalism to express itself in the selection of candidates. I think that there's a role for parties in moderating our politics. If you're a party that has to get candidates elected in the Deep South and in the Pacific Northwest, you're going to tend to try to have as broad and inviting a platform as you possibly can. If you're just one candidate on his own, trying to get elected in just one of those places, then you're more likely to be an extremist. So I think there are ways for stronger parties to help our politics. And it's not really, for me at least, fundamentally about more parties, but about stronger and more meaningful parties.
Bill?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. If we were starting from scratch, what kind of party system would we set out to create? And I can imagine arguments in favor of multi-partyism rather than for all practical purposes, the duopoly, the political duopoly that we now have. But we can't start from scratch. We have to start from where we are. And we have to recognize the fact that although our Constitution does not mention political parties, the founders didn't anticipate political parties, they didn't want political parties, they inveighed against political parties. Within 6 years after the Constitution went into operation, we've had two parties. And we've essentially had two parties ever since, except for a brief period when we had one party, the era of good feeling, and a few brief periods where we've had third parties of consequence, which always get absorbed into one of the two parties. So I think for practical reasons, I have to agree with you, Yuval, that the two-party system is our fate, and we have to improve the quality and the functioning of the political parties. Many of my friends have grown old in political party reform efforts. It is not clear to them or me that their efforts have made things better. Perhaps they've made things worse. But I don't think we have any choice, frankly. So I don't spend a lot of time speculating about a multi-party system.
Thank you. And I think we need to wrap up. So let me thank you both again for spending your time with us. It's been my distinct pleasure to discuss these topics with you and to share your insights with the audience. And let me turn the podium back over to Erin Dummeyer.
Thank you. On behalf of all sponsors and supporters who made this wonderful program possible, we extend our deepest thanks to Dr. Daniel Barrett, Dr. Yuval Levin, and Dr. William Galston. It is with gratitude that we thank the staff and volunteers of the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters for making this production possible. Please check out the library's YouTube channel for the recording and spread the word if you know someone who couldn't be here tonight. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you.